At 37, Dante Marchetti was the kind of man who could quiet a room in Providence just by walking into it the head of a family that owned the docks, the contracts, and most of the men who signed them. Then came the accident on the coast road, and one sentence from his own physician that nobody in that house ever questioned: brain dead, no chance of recovery. Nobody asked him to put it in writing, either. After that, the world simply moved on without him. 6 private caregivers were hired for the north room of the estate on Bellevue Avenue, and all 6 walked out within 5 months. The curtains stayed drawn, the door stayed shut. His older sister handed every new hire the same 3 rules: don't speak to him, don't touch the machines, don't ever stay in that room alone, and she paid $1,800 a week in cash to make sure nobody broke them. Nobody stopped to ask why a dead man needed rules. Nora Alves was 27, quiet, and broke enough to take a job 6 other people had already run from. She knew exactly what that kind of money buys, and she took it anyway, because her mother had 30 days left in a nursing home she couldn't pay for. Nobody expected her to last a week. Nobody expected anything from her at all. But on her very first morning in that room, she did something none of them had bothered to do in 11 months, and by the time anyone realized what it meant, it was far too late to stop her. If stories about loyalty, courage, and the people this world overlooks mean something to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share this one with somebody who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to the channel, because there's a brand new story waiting for you every single week. Now let's head back to that quiet room in Newport. And to the morning, a poor, shy maid walked in and refused to treat a living man like a corpse. The paper had only one side to it, and Nora Alves read it 3 times in the 2nd floor hallway at Riverbend Care in Fall River. And by the 3rd time, her fingers had begun to shake, and it wasn't from the cold, because that hallway was always kept warm enough to smother a person. The woman from the billing office stood 2 steps away, with her arms folded, waiting. 30 days, Nora said, and it wasn't a question. She was only reading it out loud, as though hearing it with her own ears might somehow change what it said. 30 days from today, the woman answered. It's a formal discharge notice, Miss Alves. We're required to issue one when an account falls 2 months behind. $14,800, Nora said. $7,400 a month. September and October. Nora folded the notice into quarters, then opened it again, the way people do when their hands need something to keep busy while their minds are trying to catch up. My mother's Medicaid application is still under review, she said. That application was denied last week. Didn't you get the letter? She had gotten the letter. She just hadn't opened it. It had been sitting in her coat pocket for 4 days. And she had lived those 4 days the way a person lives when they know there's a fire somewhere in the basement and they've decided not to go down and look. On what grounds? She asked. Her pension puts her over the state income limit, the woman said, in the flat voice of someone who had delivered that sentence a few hundred times, by $41 a month. She's over the line by exactly $41. Nora stood very still. $41. Less than a week of gas. Less than the exhaust repair she'd paid for in September. Her mother had worked the textile mills in Fall River for 32 years, and what she had to show for it was a pension just large enough to disqualify her from help, and just small enough to be useless. You can appeal, the woman offered, but an appeal takes 9 months to a year. My mother doesn't have 9 months. Then we'll need payment, Miss Alves. I'm sorry. Nora put the notice in her inside pocket, where the unopened letter was already waiting, and the 2 of them lay flat against each other like a pair of hands folded in a lap. Then she walked to the end of the hall, stopped outside room 27, took 1 breath, and went in wearing the face she'd been practicing for 2 years. Inez Alves was propped against her pillows with her left hand resting on the blanket in that particular way. It rested now, the way of a hand that no longer took instructions. She was 58. Multiple sclerosis had taken her legs 4 years ago, and was working its way, slowly and without any hurry at all, toward her breathing. You're early, her mother said. And then she coughed. It came up dry and long from somewhere deep, and Nora crossed the room and braced her shoulder without thinking about it. Palm flat in the right place, pressure in the right rhythm, emotion worn so far into her bones that no board in any state could take it out of her. The cough eased. Inez looked at her daughter. What did they hand you out there? Nothing, Mama. Nora, appointment reminder, she said. And the lie came out smooth, and she hated herself for exactly 1 second. Her mother didn't push. She only looked at her a while longer than she needed to, and then turned her face toward the window. That night, Nora sat in her car in the parking lot and called an agency whose number she'd been avoiding for 6 months. The woman on the other end found her file in under a minute. "There's a placement in Newport," she said. "Bellevue Avenue. Doing what? Housekeeping. Basic personal care. 1 bedbound patient." A pause. "I should tell you up front, that house has gone through 6 people in 5 months. Why did they leave? Nobody ever says. They just leave." Nora looked out through the windshield at the light from the care home spilling across the wet asphalt. "How much?" she asked. The woman told her. Nora asked her to say it again. She said it again. Nora took the job before she hung up. 2 days later, she was sitting in the library at the Blackthorn estate, in a chair set a little higher than comfort would suggest, across from a woman of 42 who never once offered her anything to drink. Vittoria Marchetti read her file slowly and didn't turn a single page twice. "You held a practical nursing license," she said. "Yes. It's suspended. It's under review. Then it's suspended." She closed the folder. Her voice stayed level and courteous the whole time, never rising so much as a note, and that was precisely what made the back of Nora's neck go cold. "I'm not hiring a nurse. I'm hiring someone to clean. Do you understand the difference?" "I understand it." "Good. My brother receives full medical care from qualified people. You aren't one of them." Nora nodded. "You've heard the 3 conditions from the agency." Vittoria slid a thin sheaf of paper across the table. "There's a 4th. You'll sign this." "What is it?" "A confidentiality agreement. Anything you see inside this house stays inside this house. Not friends, not family, not the internet. Break it and you'll be sued." Nora picked up the pen. She skimmed the first 2 pages, and she knew she ought to read them properly, and she knew she wasn't going to. "How is the pay handled?" she asked. $1,800 a week. Cash. Fridays. The pen stopped on the signature line for half a second. She'd been cleaning houses for 2 years, and she knew what that work was worth in Rhode Island. Nobody alive pays $1,800 a week in cash to have floors washed and sheets changed. People pay that for something else entirely. People pay that for quiet. She signed her name. Sylvia Kane, the housekeeper, walked her through the place that afternoon. Kitchen, laundry, linen store, service stairs. She spoke briefly, said only what was needed, and never once looked Nora in the face. On the 2nd floor, the hallway ran straight toward the north end and finished at a closed door. Sylvia turned left before she reached it. "What about the room at the end?" Nora asked. Sylvia didn't slow down and didn't turn her head. "You'll go in there tomorrow." She went in there the next morning at 7. And the first thing that struck her was that the room was dark in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, because the sun had been up for an hour already, and every curtain in that room was drawn shut and pinned at the center, the way people close a room they've finished with. There was a night aide sitting in a chair by the door with her phone tilted up in both hands, and she looked up when Nora came in, and then went straight back down to the screen. "Cleaner," the aide said. Nora said yes. "He's fine," the aide said, without looking up. "Vitals are fine, everything's fine. He's been fine for 11 months. She stood, stretched her back, tucked the phone into her scrub pocket, and walked out without checking anything at all, and the door swung shut behind her and left Nora alone with the only other person in the room. He lay on his back in the middle of a hospital bed that had been pushed against the far wall, and he was thinner than a man of 37 ought to be, and his beard had gone past unkempt into something else, something closer to neglect made visible. His hair was too long at the sides. There was a dry crust at the corner of his mouth that nobody had wiped. Nora stood at the end of the bed for a moment and did not move, and then she set down her supply caddy and pulled back the blanket to see how the linens had been managed, and that was when she stopped being a cleaner. He was lying the same way he'd been lying when she came in, and she had a strong suspicion he'd been lying that way for longer than a shift. She rolled him toward her, slowly, one hand at his shoulder and one at his hip, the way she'd been taught in a classroom in New Bedford when she was 19 years old, and she eased the gown up over his lower back, and there it was, a patch of broken skin over the base of his spine, red at the edges and open at the center. The kind of wound that doesn't happen overnight, and doesn't happen in a week either. A pressure sore takes time. It takes hours of a body left in one position and then more hours after that, and it takes a room where nobody comes in, and it takes 11 months of a house agreeing among themselves that there's no one in the bed worth turning. She looked at it for a long moment. She was not thinking about right and wrong. She was thinking about turn schedules and barrier cream, and whether there was a pressure relief mattress under him or just the standard foam, and her hand had already gone to the underside of the mattress to check before she'd decided to check. And it was foam. That was when the old thing woke up in her, the thing the state board had suspended and the agency had written off, and the woman in the library downstairs had told her she was not being hired for. It came back the way a language comes back. She let him down gently onto his other side, propped him with a pillow at his back and another between his knees, and she straightened up and crossed the room and took hold of the curtains and pulled them open, both panels, all the way, and the morning came into that room and landed on the floorboards and on the bed and on his face. Then she turned around and looked at him. "Good morning, Mr. Marchetti," she said. "It's Thursday, it's cold out, and it's going to rain later." He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She went to the linen store and came back with fresh sheets and a stack of towels, and she stripped that bed with him still in it, the way you do, rolling the soiled sheet toward him and the clean one after it, and then rolling him back the other way over the ridge of both, talking to him the whole time in the ordinary voice of a person explaining what she's about to do next. "I'm going to bring you toward me now. There we are. I'm going to lift your arm." And she washed him and dried him and got him into a clean gown. And she wrote down in her own head the time she had turned him, so she'd know when the next one was due. On the table by the window there was a straight razor with a bone handle, folded shut, sitting on a little cloth as though somebody had once set it there on purpose and nobody since had known what to do with it. She picked it up, she opened it, and it was still sharp, and it had a set of initials cut into the base of the handle that were not his. She ran a basin of hot water and soaked a towel and laid it over his jaw and let it sit there while she got the soap up into a lather. And then she took the towel away and she shaved him. Slowly, with the heel of her free hand steadying his cheek, working with the grain along the flat of the jaw and against it under the chin, rinsing the blade in the basin between passes, tilting his head a quarter inch when she needed to. It took her nearly 20 minutes. She wiped his face clean and rubbed a little of the balm from her own bag into his skin. And what was left underneath all of it was a man's face, and she thought that whoever had let it get that far had done it on purpose, because it's harder to walk past a man than it is to walk past a body. When she looked up, there was someone standing in the doorway, an older man, heavy-set, gray at the temples, hands hanging loose at his sides. She had no idea how long he'd been there. She found out afterward that his name was Teddy Falco, and that he'd driven for the family for 26 years, and that he'd been standing in that doorway for 10 minutes without making a sound. He didn't say anything to her. He looked at the open curtains, and at the clean sheets, and at the shaved face of the man in the bed, and something moved across his own face that she couldn't read at all. Then he turned and walked away down the hall. It was 9 days before Vittoria Marchetti came up to the second floor, and she came up because of the light. She'd been out on the south lawn with a man from the landscaping company, and she'd happened to turn and look back at the house, and there it was, plain as a broken window, the north room with both curtains open, and the morning sitting square in the glass. She didn't hurry. That was the thing about her that Nora would come to understand later, that she never once in the whole business hurried. She finished with the landscaper. She went inside. She climbed the main staircase at an ordinary pace and walked the length of the hall, and when she opened the door, Nora was on the far side of the bed with a folded towel under his heel, positioning it, and she looked up and kept her hand where it was until the towel was set right, and then she straightened. "Who opened these?" Vittoria said. "I did. Close them." Nora didn't move for a second. Then she crossed the room and closed them, panel by panel, and the room went back to being the room it had been. Vittoria stood just inside the doorway with her hands loose in front of her. "There's a set of instructions you were given before you were hired," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Do you remember all of them?" "I do." "Then say back to me why the curtains stay shut." "Because you told me they do." "That's the correct answer." Vittoria's voice hadn't risen at all. It stayed exactly where it had been in the library 9 days earlier, courteous, unhurried, a voice that belonged in a bank. "He can't see the light," she said. "He can't feel the air. Nothing in this room reaches him. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "He might," Nora said. "He doesn't. There's a physician who says he doesn't." "There's a physician," Nora said, "who's never once put that in a chart I've seen." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Vittoria looked at her for a moment longer than she needed to, and something behind her face made a note and filed it away. "You're paid to keep a corpse clean," she said. "You're not paid to hold conversations with it." "He isn't furniture," Nora said. She said it quietly. She didn't lean forward and she didn't raise her chin, and it came out flat and plain, the way a person says a thing they know to be true and expects no credit for. It was the worst possible thing she could have said. She knew that even while she was saying it. "Get your things," Vittoria said. It was Sylvia Kane who stopped it, and she didn't stop it out of kindness, and Nora understood that at the time, and never once misremembered it afterward. Sylvia had come up behind Vittoria with a stack of folded linen against her hip, and she stood in the hall until there was a gap, and then she said, "Ma'am, may I?" Vittoria turned. "The agency has nobody," Sylvia said. "I called them Tuesday about the overnight coverage. They're not sending anyone else to this address. There's a note on the file." Vittoria didn't answer. 6 in 5 months, Sylvia said. "If she goes today, you're doing the turning yourself tonight, or Mrs. Reyes is, and Mrs. Reyes gave notice on Friday." Nothing happened on Vittoria's face at all. She turned back into the room and looked at Nora for what felt like a long time. "You'll do the work you were hired for," she said. "Nothing else." "Yes, ma'am, and you won't be here long." "Understood," Nora said. Vittoria left. Sylvia stayed in the doorway a moment with the linen against her hip, and Nora waited for something. A word, a look, anything, and Sylvia gave her none of it. She said, "The towels in the hall closet are yours. Don't take from the main store." And then she went. Nora stood in the closed room with her hands at her sides. Then she opened the curtains again, not all the way, 4 inches, enough that the light fell across the floorboards and stopped short of the bed, and if a person stood in the hall and looked in, they would not have called it open. She left them like that, and that was how the shape of her days set itself. Over the next week and the weeks after it, always the same order and always the same hours. The greeting first and the turning after it, the washing, the sheets, the razor, and the basin, and the last turn of the evening at 8:30 before she went down the service stairs, and it settled into her like a rule of the house that nobody had written and nobody had approved. She never said any of it out loud to anyone. She never told Sylvia she'd been turning him every 2 hours. She never explained why the pillow went between the knees and not under them, or why she checked the heels and the elbows and the back of his head every morning with 2 fingers, or why she wrote the times down on the inside of her own wrist in pen and washed them off at the end of the day. Nobody in that house asked her a single question about any of it. And that, she thought, was the strangest part. Not that they'd let a cleaner do the work of a nurse. That they'd never once wondered how she knew how. It happened on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week, in the middle of the afternoon, when the house was quiet and Vittoria was in Providence, and Nora had the north room to herself, with a basin of warm water and a stack of clean towels, and nothing on her mind at all. That was the part she came back to later, over and over, and never could get past. She hadn't been thinking about anything. She'd been wiping down the sill and the top of the low table by the window, working her way around the room the way she did every afternoon, and somewhere in the middle of it she'd started humming, and then the humming had turned into words without her deciding that it should. It was an old thing her mother used to sing, from her mother before that, out of a village in the Azores that Nora had never seen and probably never would. She didn't know all of it. She knew the first 2 lines and the shape of the rest, the way you know a song you were sung to before you had any language to hold it in, and she sang it soft and low with a rag in her hand and her back half turned to the bed. And when she came to the end of the 2nd line, she started it over from the beginning, because that's what her mother had always done. Then she turned around. There was a wet track running down from the outside corner of his left eye, along his temple, into the hair above his ear. She stopped where she was. She stood there with the rag in her hand, and she looked at it. And the first thing she felt was not wonder and not joy. It was a kind of falling, a drop in the floor of her chest, because in 11 months of that room, nobody had cried in it, and now somebody had. She crossed to the bed. His face was exactly as it had been. Nothing had changed in it. His breathing was the same slow rhythm it had been all morning, and his hands lay where she'd placed them an hour ago, and there was only that one line of wet running down toward his ear and beginning to cool. "It's the eye," she told herself. "Eye's water. Dry air does it, and the heat in this house does it, and a body doesn't need a person inside it to make a tear." And she had said all of that to families in 3 different facilities, across 2 counties, gently, kindly, over and over. Don't read into it. It isn't what you want it to be. She had believed it every time she'd said it. She reached for a clean towel and folded a corner of it into a point, and she dried his temple, and then the track above his ear, and she did it carefully, the way you do a thing you're pretending is routine. Then she wet a cloth in the basin and wrung it out and bent over him to wipe his face, one hand braced on the mattress beside his shoulder, her wrist crossing over his open palm, and his hand closed. It closed around her wrist, and it was not a flutter, and it was not a twitch. It was a hand shutting, 4 fingers coming across the inside of her arm and the thumb settling on top of them, and it had weight in it. It had a man's grip in it, weak the way anything is weak after 11 months of lying still, but deliberate and warm and steady. And she could feel the whole hot, dry surface of his palm against the place where her own pulse ran, and she could feel her pulse going through it and slamming, and she felt underneath all of that, faintly, the slower knocking of his. 1. She did not move. She did not breathe. Her eyes went to his face, and his face did nothing at all. Not a flicker, not a crease, and his eyes stayed shut, and that was somehow worse and somehow more, because there was no expression anywhere on him to explain the hand. 2. Then it let go, not thrown off, not dropped. It opened and let go, and the fingers uncurled and lay back down onto the sheet, exactly where they had been before, palm up, still, and the whole thing was over. She stood up slowly. Her arm was shaking, and she put it against her side to stop it. She looked at the door. It was shut, and the hall past it was silent. And there was nobody in the house on that floor except the 2 of them. She wanted, very badly and very suddenly, for there to have been somebody in the doorway. She stayed in that room another 40 minutes and finished the afternoon turn, and her hands did the work correctly, and she found afterward that she could not remember doing any of it. At 8:30, she went down the service stairs and out to her car and sat behind the wheel in the dark with the key in her hand and did not put it in the ignition. Sylvia's light was on in the kitchen window. She could have gone back in. It would have taken 30 seconds. She thought about Teddy Falco, who had stood in that doorway 10 minutes without saying a word and had never once mentioned it to her since. She thought about the woman in the library who had told her he couldn't feel the air. She started the car and drove to Fall River and said nothing to anybody, and she couldn't have told you why. She didn't sleep that night, or the 4 nights after it, and by the end of the week she'd stopped pretending she was going to. She sat up in the kitchen of her apartment in Fall River with her phone propped against the sugar tin, and she read. She read the way she used to read for exams, badly and hungrily and too fast. And then she went back and read the same pages again slowly. She learned that there is a difference between a vegetative state and a minimally conscious state, and that the difference is the whole world, and that it lives in things as small as a hand closing. She learned that the second one gets missed. She read a study out of a hospital in Belgium and another out of a unit in New York, and both of them said the same thing in different words, that a large share of patients carrying one label belong under the other, and one of them put the number at 4 out of every 10. 4 out of every 10. She sat with that for a long time. Then she read what it takes to tell them apart, and it turned out that it doesn't take a scanner, and it doesn't take a laboratory. It takes somebody in the room asking the same question over and over on different days, and writing down what comes back. That was the part that kept her up. Not that he might be in there. That finding out was something anybody could have done, at any point in 11 months, for free, in about 5 minutes. In the morning, she went in at 7 and did the greeting and the turn and the washing in the ordinary order. And then she pulled the chair over to the side of the bed and sat down and put her hand into his, palm to palm, and let it rest there. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to take your time." Nothing in the room moved. "Squeeze my hand once if you can hear me." She counted in her head. She got to 11, and then to 20, and she was already telling herself what she'd tell herself afterward. And then his fingers came in against the back of her hand, and pressed and let go. She sat there without moving. Then she asked him again, and asked him to wait a moment first, and then do it. And she waited a moment, and it came again, late, exactly as late as she'd asked for. She got up and walked to the far wall and slid down it, and sat on the floorboards with her arms across her knees. She stayed there a while. She had thought she would cry, and she found that she couldn't. That whatever was in her chest had gone hard and flat instead, like a held breath that wouldn't come out. She looked across the room at the bed from down there and thought about 11 months of that ceiling. Dr. Warren Hale came to the house on Thursdays. He was 56 years old, silver at the temples, unhurried, the kind of physician who has been the physician to one family for so long that he no longer entirely works for anybody. She caught him in the upstairs hall as he was closing his bag. "Dr. Hale," May I show you something? Something wrong with the linens, something with the patient, she told him. She kept it short, and she kept it flat, and she used the words correctly. Response to command, reproducible on request, latency consistent with instruction, and she watched him listen with his head tipped a little to one side, and a small patient smile on his mouth that never once reached anywhere else on his face. When she finished, he set the bag down on the hall table. Spinal reflex, he said. It's very common. The cord does a great deal without the brain, and a hand that's been curled for months will close on anything that touches it, and if you're standing there asking it questions at the same time, you'll swear it answered you. He hadn't answered you. I asked him to wait. Then he waited by coincidence, and you'll find that coincidence is generous when a person is looking for one. He picked up his bag again. This happens with families, more often than you'd think, and there's no shame in it. But you're not family, and you're not clinical staff, and I'd suggest you leave the clinical assessment to the people qualified to make it. It occurred to me that you might not be entirely clear on where that line falls. I'm clear on it, she said. Are you? And then his voice changed. It happened between one sentence and the next, so smoothly that she almost didn't catch the seam, and afterward she would think about that seam more than about anything else he said. Because I understand there's an open matter with your license, he said. Suspended, is it? Pending review with the board up in Massachusetts. Now, that's your business and not mine, and I've no interest in it, but a person in that position wants to be careful about where she's seen practicing, and about what she's heard telling people she's assessed. Boards take a very dim view. He smiled at her again, pleasantly. It would be a shame to make a bad situation worse. Then he went down the stairs, and she heard the front door, and she heard his car on the gravel, and she stood in the upstairs hall for a long moment without moving. Vittoria Marchetti had her file. Vittoria Marchetti had read it out loud to her in the library, page by page, and closed it. Nobody else in that house had ever seen it. She was the cleaner. He was the family physician. He had no reason on earth to know her name, let alone the status of a license she hadn't used in 2 years. So how did he know? She started with the chart. It hung on a clipboard at the foot of the bed, and in 5 weeks, she had never once turned a page of it, because a cleaner has no business turning pages, and because until Thursday she'd had no reason to. On Monday morning, she closed the door and lifted it off its hook. The administration record ran 3 sheets. She read it the way she'd been trained to read one. Down the left margin first for the standing orders, then across for the times and the initials. Feeds, fluids, a stool softener, a muscle relaxant for the contractures in his left arm, and one more, at the bottom, in the same hand as the rest. A sedative, continuous, every day, without a break, for as far back as the sheets went. She stood with the clipboard against her chest and did the only arithmetic that mattered. You sedate a person to keep him from struggling. You sedate a person to stop him from pulling at a line, or grinding his jaw, or thrashing when he's turned. You sedate a person who reacts to things. She looked over at the bed. So why would anybody spend 11 months keeping a dead man calm? She hung the chart back on its hook, squared it to the rail exactly as she'd found it, and went and got the mop bucket. That afternoon she drove to the pharmacy on County Street in Fall River and bought a composition notebook for $1.80, the cheap kind with a marbled cover. She wrote nothing on the front of it. She started on the first line of the first page, with the date and the time, and what she'd asked, and what had come back, and she wrote it in the format she'd used at 2 facilities and a rehabilitation unit. Time, stimulus, response, latency, witness, and where the witness line should have gone. She wrote her own name, and then looked at it for a while. She kept the notebook under the spare tire in the trunk of her car. She never carried it into the house. What she carried into the house was her phone, an old one with a cracked corner that she'd been meaning to replace for a year, and she carried it in the front pocket of her apron, with the lens facing out and the top edge riding just above the hem. The first time she tried it, she got 40 seconds of the ceiling and her own thumb. The second time she got the bed, but not his hand. By the 4th day, she'd worked out that if she knelt at the side rail and set the phone propped against the water pitcher on the tray table, angled down, she got his forearm and his hand, and her own hand entering the frame, and she got her own voice asking, and she got the pause, and she got the fingers. She did it in the 10 minutes after the night aide left, and before the house woke up. She never did it twice in the same position. She never did it on a Thursday. Every evening she carried the card out to the car in the toe of her shoe, copied nothing, deleted nothing, and started a new file the next day. She was not building a case, because it hadn't occurred to her that there was a case. She was doing what she'd been taught to do, in a room where a finding is only worth what the documentation behind it is worth, and the documentation was worth nothing without a second set of eyes, and she had no second set of eyes, so she was making the record and waiting for the day somebody would look at it. That was all it was. It nearly ended on the Friday. She was at the side rail with the phone propped and the recording running, halfway through the second ask, when the door came open behind her without a knock. Sylvia Kane. Nora's hand went out and took the phone, and it was in her apron pocket before she'd stood all the way up, and she turned around, already talking, saying the picture needed changing, and asking whether the spare draw sheets had come back from the laundry, and she heard her own voice do it, and thought that it sounded exactly like a woman lying. Sylvia didn't answer straight away. She stood in the doorway with her hand still on the knob, and she looked at the tray table, at the picture standing 3 inches out of its ring, on the wet mark where something else had been sitting a second ago. Then she looked at Nora's apron pocket. Then she looked at Nora's face. "The laundry came back Wednesday," she said. "They're in the hall closet where they always are. Thank you. Mrs. Marchetti is having people at the house tonight. Stay off the main staircase after 6. "Yes, ma'am." Sylvia stayed in the doorway another second and a half. She didn't ask a single question. She turned and pulled the door to behind her, and Nora heard her heels go the whole length of the hall, unhurried, the same pace they always went. Nora stood there with her hand flat against the outside of her apron and the shape of the phone under it, and her heart going, and the thought that came to her was not relief. It was that Sylvia Kane had seen the picture, and had seen the wet ring, and had said nothing at all. She looked down at the man in the bed. Somebody in this house, she thought, is paying a great deal of money every single day to keep you quiet. She just couldn't work out who was paying, or what they thought he might say. He came on a Wednesday in the 6th week, and he came up the service stairs instead of the main ones, which nobody in that house had ever done. Nora heard him before she saw him, 2 knuckles on the open door, and she turned around, and there was a man of about 40 standing in the doorway, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "Matteo Barone," he said. "I should have called ahead." "I never do." Nora dried her hands on her apron. He didn't come in. He waited on the threshold until she said he could, which was the first time in 6 weeks that anybody in that house had waited for her to say anything. Then he crossed the room and set one of the cups down on the sill next to her, and it was still hot, and the lid had a sugar packet folded under it. "I didn't know how you take it," he said. "I brought sugar in case. There's a place on Thames Street, the good one, not the one with the awning." Nora looked at the cup. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it, and it startled her how much she meant it. He pulled the chair over to the side of the bed and sat down in it heavily, the way a man sits when his back is going, and he leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the man in the bed for a while without saying anything at all. "Somebody's been shaving him," he said. "That's me." "It's better," he said. "Thank you for that." Then he started talking to Dante. Not about him. To him. He said the marina had finally put in the new floats, and they'd done it wrong, the way everybody had said they would. And there was a thing with the Fairhaven job that Dante would have laughed at, and he told him about it. The whole story, the permits, and the man from the town, and the fence that had gone up 18 inches over the line. And somewhere in the middle of it, he said, "And you would have said I told you so. And you'd have been right," and he stopped and looked at his hands. Nora stood at the window with the coffee going warm through the paper, and did not know where to put herself. He'd been in the room 10 minutes, and he'd already done what nobody else who came through that door had ever done, which was to talk in that room the way you talk to a person. "How long have you known him?" she asked. "Since we were 9, he said. "Same street. His mother used to feed me because mine worked nights." He rubbed the back of his neck. 28 years. Then he turned around in the chair and looked at her properly for the first time and asked her name. And when she gave it, he asked how it was spelled. And she told him. And he nodded like it mattered. "Alves," he said. "Fall River?" "Yes. My grandmother was in Fall River. Corky Row." He smiled. "You've got family there still?" "My mother," Nora said. "She's at Riverbend. Ines." She said the name before she'd decided to say it, and afterward she couldn't account for it, except that he'd asked the way people ask when they intend to remember the answer. "She's not well?" "No," Nora said. "She isn't." He didn't fill the silence after that with anything. He just let it sit, which she had noticed was a rare thing in a man, and then he said, "That's a hard road," and left it there. They talked a little more. He asked whether the house was treating her decently, and she said it was fine. And he looked at her and said, "That's a no." And she laughed before she could stop herself, and it was the first time she had laughed inside that house in 6 weeks. He got up eventually and stood at the foot of the bed with his hand on the rail. He didn't look at her when he asked it. He was looking down at Dante, and his voice went quieter than it had been all afternoon, and there was a roughness in it that hadn't been there before. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Does he ever?" he said, and then stopped and started again. "Does he ever do anything? React to anything? Move? Anything at all?" Nora opened her mouth, and what came out of it was, "No, nothing. Not once." She heard herself say it. She heard the flatness she put into it, the small, tired shrug of a woman who has been in that room a long time and has stopped hoping. And she watched Matteo Barone take it, and she watched his face do the thing a man's face does when the last small door he'd been holding open closes. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's what they told me." He tapped the rail twice with 2 fingers, the way you knock on a table when you're getting up to leave. And he said, "I'll come back in a couple weeks. And thank you for the shaving. It matters more than you'd think." Then he went down the service stairs the same way he'd come up. Nora stood in that room with a cup of good coffee going cold in her hand, and could not for the life of her explain what she'd just done. He was the only person in the whole house who had been kind to her. He was the only one who'd spoken to Dante like a man, and not like a piece of furniture. He had asked out of love. She had looked him in the face and lied to him, cleanly, without hesitating, and she had done it before her mind had even started working. She didn't understand it. She would spend a long time not understanding it. The changes came on a Monday, all of them at once, in the way of a person who has been thinking about something for a while and then acts on a schedule. Sylvia handed her the new hours in the kitchen before 7, 6 to 2, 2 hours cut off the front and 6.5 off the back, and the 8:30 turn, the last one of the day, was gone from her hands entirely. "Who does the evening turns now?" Nora asked. "Night staff." "There is no night staff after 9, Nora said. "There is now," Sylvia said, and went back to the laundry list. The second change was that Nora's break room and her locker and the little chair where she ate her lunch were all moved down to the service wing behind the kitchen, and her key card was reissued, and the new one didn't open the main staircase. And the third change was waiting for her when she went up at 7. It sat high on the wall above the doorframe in the north room, on the inside, angled down across the bed and the whole right side of the room where the chair and the tray table stood. Small, white, a black eye in the middle of it and a green pinpoint below that. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went in and did the greeting and the turn. And she did not sit down in the chair, and she did not kneel at the side rail, and she did not take the phone out of her apron. She never took it out in that room again. She found she could still ask him things. If she stood on the far side of the bed with her back to the lens and her body between it and his hand, and she found that this was a poor arrangement and that she would have to think of something better. Vittoria came up at 9. She looked at the camera and then at Nora, and she seemed almost pleasant about it. "It's for his protection," she said. "And for yours, frankly." "Yes, ma'am. There's been a great deal of comfort taken in this house lately, with what a person can and can't do in that room." "Yes, ma'am." Vittoria walked to the foot of the bed and stood there with her hands loose, looking down at her brother. It was the only time in the whole business that Nora saw her look at him for longer than a second. "My father had 2 children," she said. "He only ever saw one of them." She said it quietly, and she said it to nobody in particular. And then she turned and left. And she never said anything like it again for as long as Nora knew her. Nora went down the service stairs at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and she'd gotten as far as the corridor outside the small office by the pantry when she heard Vittoria's voice through the door and stopped walking. She was on speaker. The lawyer's voice came out thin and far away. Nora stood against the wall with a bundle of towels in her arms and did not move. "The hearing's on the calendar," the lawyer was saying. "Probate court, Newport County. It's 6 weeks out. Can it be sooner?" "It can't. 6 weeks." "Fine," Vittoria said. "And when it's granted, then you're the guardian of the person and the estate both, and you can place him where you like. Which brings me to the other thing. I've had the paperwork back from the facility outside Hartford, Connecticut," Vittoria said. "Connecticut," the lawyer said. That's the point of it. The moment he's across the state line, a Rhode Island court has no reach over where he is or who sees him. Anybody who wants to make trouble after that files in a different state and starts over from nothing, and nobody has the money or the stomach for that. And how long would it take to move him? A morning. Do the paperwork, Vittoria said. Then there was the sound of a chair, and Nora was already walking down the corridor and through the kitchen and out the side door with the towels still in her arms, and she got all the way to her car before she understood she was still carrying them. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel. 6 weeks. She drove down the gravel and out through the gate, and at the bend in the road about 100 yards past the wall, in the shade where the hedge came down, there was a car parked on the shoulder facing the house. A dark sedan, plain, no markings, 2 people in the front seats. She'd seen it there twice before and hadn't thought about it. She thought about it now for about 4 seconds. Of course, she thought. Of course she has people watching the road. Somebody like that would. And she drove past it toward Fall River, and she did not look at it again in the mirror, and she spent the whole ride doing arithmetic she couldn't make come out right. 6 weeks was 42 days. 42 days until a courtroom in Newport County handed that woman the legal right to put her brother in a van and take him over a state line and close a door. She made it at her kitchen table on a Sunday night out of the back of a cereal box and a black marker, 6 rows of letters in blocks big enough to read from 4 feet away, and she cut it down to the size of a sheet of paper so it would lie flat inside the folded towels at the bottom of her caddy. On Monday morning, she carried it up the service stairs under 2 draw sheets and a bottle of skin barrier cream. The camera watched the bed and the right side of the room. It did not watch the narrow strip of floor between the bed and the window wall, because there was nothing over there but 18 inches of board and a radiator. She worked that out in about 4 minutes with her back to the lens. At 7:20, she moved the chair, not to the side rail where it always went, but around to the far side, into that strip, and she sat down with her shoulders square to the camera and the board flat on her knees below the level of the mattress. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, "I'm going to try something, and it's going to be slow, and I need you to stay with me." His eyes were open that morning. They had been open more often lately, though they never went anywhere and never fixed on anything. 1 blink for yes, she said. 2 for no. Can you do that for me? Nothing. She waited. Then, once, deliberately, the lids came down and up. She had to put the board on the floor for a second and press both hands flat against her knees. Then she picked it up again. "I'm going to read the rows. Blink when I get to yours. First row, A through E. Second row, F through J. Third row, K through O. Nothing. Fourth row, P through T. 1 blink." She went back to the beginning of that row and said the letters one at a time with a full second between them, and it was on the third one that she realized she had no idea how to keep herself from hoping, and she made herself say the letters flat, and even the way you read a list to a stranger. P, Q, R. 1 blink. R. She wrote it on the edge of the board with the marker, and her hand was not steady. She started the rows again. It took 9 minutes to get the second letter, because he took the second row and then wouldn't take any letter in it, and she went through F, G, H, I, J twice and got nothing, and she sat there with the sweat coming up under her collar and thought that this was it, that this was the coincidence Hale had talked about, that a lid comes down when a lid comes down. Then she thought about how long a man lies still before he can make anything at all obey him, and she went back to the top and started over from the first row. Slower. Second row. 1 blink. F. Nothing. G. Nothing. H. Nothing. I. Nothing. J. Nothing. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, "if I got it wrong, that's all right. We'll go again." 2 blinks. She almost laughed, and the sound that came out of her was not a laugh. Fourth row. 1 blink. P, Q, R, S, T. Nothing at all. She sat back. Then she understood. And she felt stupid for not understanding sooner, because his eyes had been open for 19 minutes without closing properly, and the lids were dragging, and everything was costing him more than it had cost him at the start. She put the board face down on her knees and said, "We're going to rest for 5 minutes," and she sat there in the 18 inches of floor by the radiator and watched the second hand on her own watch go around 5 times. Then she started again. Fourth row. 1 blink. P, Q, R, S, T, U. She had put U in the fourth row because there were 6 rows, and the letters hadn't come out even. 1 blink. 26 minutes gone. She had thought about this for a week, lying awake in Fall River, and she had thought she knew what he was going to say. She had thought he would give her a name. She had thought it would be his sister's, or that it would be somebody she'd never heard of, a man from the docks, someone from whatever life had put him in that bed, and that she would write it down in the notebook under the spare tire and take it to somebody. Third row, nothing. Fifth row, one blink. She read them. U, V, W, X, Y. And then she stopped, because there was only one left in it, and she'd already said the others, and she said the last one anyway, out loud, into the quiet of that room. N. One blink. She sat very still with the board on her knees and looked at the 3 letters written along its edge in black marker. R-U-N. It happened for the most ordinary reason in the world. And Nora would think later that this was the only piece of luck she got in the whole 11 months, and that it came out of an invoice. On the Tuesday of the 9th week, the infusion company that serviced the house stopped delivering. Sylvia took the call in the kitchen, and Nora heard one end of it while she was filling a bucket. A long silence, and then Sylvia saying, "That's not something I can authorize." And then, "I'll pass it to Mrs. Marchetti." And then, "I understand that, but I'm telling you I can't." There was a balance outstanding. There had been letters. Somebody in an office in Warwick had finally decided that a house on Bellevue Avenue could go 3 days without a delivery like anybody else, and the sedative that had run into that man every day for 11 months stopped arriving on a Tuesday morning and did not arrive again until Friday. Nora did not touch a single thing. She wrote down the time the last bag ran out, and she wrote down who told her, and she wrote down the name of the company, and then she went on doing exactly what she had been doing: the greeting, the turn, the washing, the cream on the pressure sore that had been closed over for 2 weeks now, and she kept her hands entirely off the pump and the line and the pole, because she knew what a board would do with a woman in her position who had so much as adjusted a rate, and because it had never once entered her head to do it. By Wednesday afternoon his eyes had changed. That was the only way she could describe it, then or afterward. They didn't open wider and they didn't move faster. They simply came into focus, the way a face at the end of a hallway resolves as it comes toward you. And when she crossed the room from the window to the linen cupboard, his eyes went with her, all the way, and stopped when she stopped. She stood at the cupboard with her hand on the door, and her back to him, and made herself count to 10. Then she walked back across the room the other way, slowly, and they tracked her the whole distance. By Thursday, he was following her hands when she worked. He watched her wring the cloth. He watched her fold the towel into quarters. When she brought the razor and the basin over at 11, he watched the razor come toward his face, and his breathing changed for a moment, faster and then slower. And she stopped and said, "It's only me. It's the shave. Same as always." And it settled. She did 5 sessions with the board in those 3 days, and got answers in half the time it had taken her on the Monday. She kept the notebook filled in the trunk of her car, and she got 2 recordings on the memory card, both taken from the 18 inches of floor by the radiator with her back to the camera. And on the Thursday evening, at the end of the last turn, she was folding the spare sheet at the foot of the bed, and she said, without planning to say it, "Do you want some music?" The words were out before she'd thought about them. She heard herself and felt foolish, because it wasn't clinical, and it wasn't on any list, and there was no reason on earth to ask it. One blink. She stood there with the sheet half folded in her arms. Every question she had put to that man in 9 weeks had been a question about his body. "Can you hear me? Does this hurt? Are you cold?" She had been treating him the way you treat a set of readings, carefully and correctly, and it had not occurred to her once to ask him what he wanted. She put her phone on the tray table and found something old and quiet and let it play low, and she finished the folding, and she stayed in the room until it ended, even though her shift had been over for 20 minutes. Neither of them did anything else. On Friday, the delivery came. By Saturday, his eyes had gone soft again and stopped following her, and by Sunday, they were what they had been, and she stood in the doorway on Monday morning and watched him not see her come in. That was the day she made up her mind. She did it from the public library on North Main Street in Fall River, on a computer that wasn't hers, on a form she'd found on the state website, addressed to the health department in Providence, and she filled it in the way she'd have filled in an incident report. Dates, times, the standing order for continuous sedation, the response to command, reproducible, documented, and what happened to it when the drug stopped, and what happened to it again when the drug came back. She did not put her name on it. There was a box for the complainant's name, and she left it empty. and she sat there for a full minute with the cursor in that box before she clicked past it, because she had learned exactly once already in her life what happens to a woman who signs her name to a thing like that. She submitted it at 4:20 in the afternoon, and she got an automatic message that said her report had been received and would be reviewed. Nothing came back that week. Nothing came back the week after. She checked the mail every day and there was nothing. And no one from the state came to the house, and no telephone rang. And after a while, she stopped checking. She thought that the report had gone into a drawer somewhere, and that nobody had read it. She was wrong about that. Somebody had. She went back to the board in the 11th week, and she went back to it because of the arithmetic. 16 days left before a courtroom in Newport County. Nothing from the state. Nobody coming. She sat down in the 18 inches of floor by the radiator on a Tuesday morning at 7:10, with the cardboard flat on her knees below the level of the mattress, and she said, "I'm going to ask you about the accident, and I need you to understand that I'm asking whether somebody did it." 1 blink for yes. Was it an accident? 2 blinks. She sat with that for a moment. Her mouth had gone dry. Was it somebody outside the family? Business. 2 blinks. Was it a person? Nothing. She rephrased it. Did somebody do something to the car? 1 blink. She wrote car on the edge of the board. What was it? She said, and then caught herself, because he couldn't answer a question shaped like that, and she started again with the rows. It took 11 minutes. B-R-A. And she stopped him there, because she already had it, and she said, "Brakes," and he blinked once, and she sat back against the radiator and looked at the ceiling for a second. He'd come down the coast road at night in his own car. She'd read the 2 paragraphs about it in the archive of the Newport paper on a library computer. 1 lane, a wall, no other vehicle involved, no charges. Where was the car kept? She said. Rose. The garage. She started asking it the fast way, the way they'd worked out over 9 weeks. Closed questions only, yes and no, and letters only, when there was no other road to it. Was the car in the garage that night before you drove it? 1 blink. Is the garage locked? 1 blink. How many people have a key? She counted it out with her fingers up where he could see them. 1, 2, 3. 1 blink. 3. 3 people in the world could open that door. She sat in the strip of floor by the window, with the cold coming off the radiator grill against her shoulder, and she thought about what she was about to ask for, and about what it would mean to be a woman in a service uniform carrying 3 names like that around in her head. Then she thought about 16 days. "All right," she said. "I'm going to ask you for the names, 1 at a time. We'll take as long as you need." She lifted the board. "First row," she said. A through E, nothing. Second row, F through J, nothing. Third row, K through O, nothing. Fourth row, P through T, nothing. Fifth row, U through Y, nothing. She went back to the top and started again, slower, and got nothing again, and she was about to ask him whether he wanted to rest, when she understood that his eyes had been on hers the entire time, and hadn't left them once, and that he was not failing to answer. He was deciding. "Mr. Marchetti," she said. "Please." "Third row," she said. "M." 1 blink. She almost dropped the board. "M." She wrote a capital M on the edge of the cardboard next to the word car, and she felt her own heart going in her ears. And she said, "All right." Second letter, and she started at the top again. First row, A through E. 1 blink. She read them out 1 at a time with a full second between them. And on the very first letter, she said A, and he blinked once. M-A. She wrote the A next to the M, and she was about to ask for the third row when the door opened. It came open without a knock, all the way, in 1 push, and Sylvia Kane was standing in it. Nora did not have time to move the board. It was on her knees, face up, 6 rows of black block letters on a cereal box, with the word car written along one edge in marker and the letters M-A beside it, and her hand was still in the air where it had been pointing at the row. Sylvia stood in the doorway with a stack of folded linen against her hip, and she did not say anything at all. She looked at Nora sitting on the floor in the 18 inches between the bed and the window wall. In the one strip of that room, the camera above the door could not see, which she had chosen, and which Sylvia now understood she had chosen. She looked at the board. She looked at Dante Marchetti lying in the bed with his eyes open, and turned toward the woman on the floor beside him, and Nora watched her understand all of it, in order, in about 4 seconds. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing in Sylvia Kane's face that Nora could read, and Nora had been reading faces in bad rooms for 8 years. Then Sylvia stepped back into the hall and pulled the door to behind her, and it closed with the small click of a latch seating properly. Nora sat on the floor, with the board on her knees, and listened to her heels go the whole length of the hallway toward the main stairs, unhurried, exactly the same pace they always went. It came on the Thursday, and it came at 8 in the evening, which was 6 hours after Nora's shift had ended, and she'd been called back to the house by a message from Sylvia that said only, "Come in tonight, 7:45. Front hall." Everyone was in the library. Sylvia by the door. Teddy Falco standing near the window with his hands behind his back. 2 of the day staff. Dr. Warren Hale in an armchair with his ankle across his knee. Vittoria Marchetti behind the long table with a laptop open in front of her and a manila folder squared beside it. And she waited until Nora was fully in the room before she began. And she began pleasantly. "I received a call from the Department of Health in Providence on Monday," she said. "Somebody filed a complaint against this household. Anonymously." She turned a page in the folder without looking down at it. "They don't release names, but they do send you the substance of the allegation, so that you can respond to it. And the substance of this one contained dates and times and the contents of a medication record that hangs at the foot of a bed on the 2nd floor of my house. There are 4 people with access to that record. 3 of them have been here more than 6 years. Nora said nothing. "There's no law against filing a complaint," Vittoria said. "I want to be clear about that. I've no interest in the complaint. What interests me is what a person was doing in that room that made her want to file one." She turned the laptop around. The picture was from above the door, angled down. The date was in the corner. It was 11:10 in the morning, and the sun was coming through the 4 inches of open curtain, and Nora watched herself walk into the frame with the basin in her hands, and set it on the tray table, and lean over the bed, and take her brother's face in her left hand and turn it, and lay the blade of a straight razor flat against the side of his throat. Vittoria let it run for 11 seconds. Then she stopped it. Nobody in that room moved. The angle had taken away the towel. It had taken away the lather, because the lather was on the far side of the jaw. It had taken away the 20 minutes on either side of it. The water, the basin, the balm, the whole of it, and what was left in the frame was a woman with her hand on an unconscious man's face and a blade against his neck. "I've been advised," Vittoria said, "to send this to the Newport police tonight. Dr. Hale, would you tell everyone what you found this afternoon?" Hale uncrossed his ankle. "There's a notebook," he said, "found in the trunk of Miss Alviz's vehicle this afternoon, in the course of an inspection of staff vehicles on the property, which is provided for in the employment agreement she signed." He held it up. The cheap marbled cover looked very small in his hand. "It's a clinical log. Times, stimuli, responses, latencies. It's been kept for 8 weeks. It's the record of a person conducting a course of neurological assessment on a patient she has no authorization to touch and no license to assess, in a state where she isn't licensed at all, on a man who cannot consent to any of it." Nora looked at the notebook. She had put it under the spare tire that morning like every morning. "That's my property," she said. "It's evidence," Hale said, "of unauthorized interference in a course of treatment." Nora turned to Sylvia. She didn't plan it. She simply turned her head. And Sylvia Kane was standing by the door with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the carpet about 3 feet in front of her own shoes, and she did not raise her eyes, and she did not say one word. Nora turned to Teddy Falco. Teddy was looking straight out the window into the dark. "You'll leave the property tonight," Vittoria said. "Your final pay will be mailed. If you approach this house again, or contact anyone in it, or say one word about anything you've seen inside it, we'll file on the confidentiality agreement, and I'll send that recording to the police the same afternoon, and I'll add the notebook to it, and you can explain the difference between nursing and attempted murder to a detective in Newport, with no license, no employer, and no money. Do you understand me? I need to get my things from downstairs. You'll be escorted out." Nora looked at the doorway that led to the hall, and past it to the staircase that went up to the 2nd floor, and to the hallway that ran north and ended in a closed door, and she thought about a man lying in the dark up there with his eyes open, who had spent 40 minutes of his life spelling one word to warn her, and who had no way on this earth of knowing what had just happened in the room beneath him, or of saying a single thing about it if he had. Then 2 of the day staff walked her out. They didn't touch her. One of them went ahead and one behind, and they took her down the service corridor past her own locker, which she wasn't permitted to open, and out the side door onto the gravel. It was raining a little. She got into her car and drove down the drive and stopped at the gate and waited for it to swing. Then she pulled out onto Bellevue Avenue and stopped again, on the shoulder, 20 feet past the wall, and sat there with the wipers going and the engine running and both hands on the wheel, looking back at the iron and the hedge and the one lit window on the second floor at the north end of the house. She'd been sitting on the shoulder about 4 minutes when headlights came down the drive behind her and the gate swung again, and a car came out and pulled in ahead of hers and stopped, and a man got out into the rain and came back along the shoulder and knocked once on her window with a knuckle. Teddy Falco. He got into the passenger seat without being asked and shut the door and sat there in his wet coat with his hands on his knees, and for a while he didn't say anything at all. Then he said, "I've got about 10 minutes before somebody notices which way I went." "All right," Nora said. "There's a thing I've been carrying around for 11 months, he said, "and I'm too old to carry it any further, and there isn't going to be anybody else to give it to after tonight." He looked out through the windshield at the rain on the road. That night, he was supposed to have somebody in the car with him. "Who?" "Matteo," he said. "Barone." They were driving down to Fairhaven together in the morning, and Mr. Barone was going to stay at the house and go with him. He rubbed his palm slowly across his knee. He called at 9:10 and said he couldn't. Something came up. He'd drive himself and meet him there. Nora didn't say anything. 9:10, Teddy said. Accident was at 18 minutes after 10. He canceled an hour before. She looked at the side of his face. "Why didn't you tell anybody?" He was quiet a moment. "Who?" he said. "Who was I going to tell? Miss Vittoria? A police officer?" He shook his head slowly. "Once. I'm the driver. I've been the driver for 26 years. You say a thing like that out loud about a man like Mr. Barone and nobody hears the thing. They hear who said it." Then he opened the door partway and stopped, and said one more thing. "Those cars out at the bend in the road. There's been one out there most days since the accident." He looked at her. "That's not our people. Never has been." He shut the door and went back to his car and drove off toward Newport, and she sat on the shoulder with the wipers going and did not move for a long time. She drove to Fall River. It was past 10 and Riverbend didn't allow visitors after 8, but the woman on the night desk knew her by then and looked at her face and let her go up. Room 27. The light was off and the door was open, a hand's width, and Nora went in and stood there. Her mother was awake. Ines had gone down since the last visit, and it had happened fast the way it does at the end, and it was in her breathing before anything else. A shallowness at the top of the chest that didn't reach anywhere. Her left hand was on the blanket, and her right had come across to hold the rail. Nora pulled the chair over and sat and took her mother's hand in both of hers, and she found that it was very cold, and she put it against her own cheek to warm it and held it there. "I lost the job, Mama," she said. Her mother's eyes came around. "I lost the job tonight. They put a camera in his room and they took my notebook out of my car, and they told me if I ever say a word about any of it, they'll go to the police, and there's 14 days left on your notice, and I've got nothing." She heard her own voice break, and she stopped and pressed her mouth against her mother's knuckles until it passed. "There was a man in that house," she said. "He's alive in there, Mama. He's awake. He's been awake the whole time, and there's nobody left in that house who knows it except me, and I'm not allowed within 100 feet of him." Ines said nothing. She'd stopped being able to say much of anything 3 weeks before, and Nora had gotten used to talking into that silence, and had learned that the silence wasn't empty. But her mother's fingers moved inside her hands, and Nora looked up, and Ines was watching her with a great deal of effort. She said it very slowly, and it cost her a great deal, and she stopped twice in the middle of it to get the air. "Nobody remembers," she said, "how much you made. They remember," she said, "who stayed." Then she closed her eyes, her breathing settling into a slow, steady sleep. Nora sat there holding her mother's hand against her cheek in that dark room in Fall River, feeling the faint, reassuring warmth of her skin. And she cried, finally, after 11 weeks and 4 days of holding it, and she cried the way people cry when they've been carrying a heavy burden alone and have finally been told that their devotion mattered, quietly, her shoulders shaking while her mother slept peacefully beside her. She didn't say anything back. She didn't tell her mother she'd fix it, or that she'd find the money, or that she was going to do anything at all about any of it, because she had run out of things she could promise anybody. She just stayed there until the sky over the mill roof started going gray, and the night nurse came in at 5:30 and found the two of them like that. and did not say a word about the hour, and went out again and closed the door. It took her 2 days to find the number, and she found it the way anybody finds anything, on a public records site for $11, a listing in Naples, Florida, in the name of Rosalind Marchetti, at an address on a street she'd never heard of. She called at 4 p.m. on the Tuesday from the parking lot of a supermarket in Fall River because she couldn't make herself do it inside her own apartment. It rang 5 times. "Hello, Mrs. Marchetti. My name is Nora Alves. I worked in your son's house in Newport until last week." There was a silence on the line that went on long enough that Nora checked the screen to see whether the call had dropped. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you about Dante. I buried my son 11 months ago," the woman said. Her voice was low and flat and entirely steady, and that was what made it terrible. "I buried him in a room I'm not allowed into, in a house I'm not welcome in, and I did it standing up, in Florida, on the telephone. So whatever it is you're selling, or whatever it is you think you know about my family, Mrs. Marchetti, why are you calling me?" And she hung up. Nora sat in the car with the phone in her lap. On Wednesday morning, there was a knock at her apartment door in Fall River at 7:10. Sylvia Kane was standing in the corridor in a coat, with her handbag held in front of her in both hands, like a woman waiting for a bus. Nora didn't say anything. Sylvia reached into the bag and took out the composition notebook with the marbled cover and held it out. Nora took it. Then Sylvia put out her other hand, and there was a memory card in the palm of it, the little black one from Nora's phone, and Nora took that too. "They were in Dr. Hale's coat pocket in the hall closet," Sylvia said. "He left it on the hook overnight." Nora looked at the 2 things in her hands. "Why?" Sylvia's mouth moved slightly. "Because I've worked in that house 9 years, she said, "and I've done what I was told for 9 years, and I looked at the floor on Thursday night." Then she said, "I only came to give you those," and she turned to go, and stopped at the top of the stairs, and said one more thing without turning around. "It wasn't me who told her about you." Then she went down. Nora went back inside and sat on the edge of her bed with the notebook on one knee and the card in her hand, and she looked at them for a while. Then she got the card reader out of the drawer and put the file on her laptop and cut 41 seconds out of the middle of it, and she sent it to the number in Naples, Florida, with 3 lines under it. "This is your son on the 4th of last month. I am asking him to blink once for yes. He does it every time I ask." She sent it at 9:20 in the morning, and then she put the phone face down on the table and went and did the dishes, and cleaned the stove, and stripped her bed, and washed the floor of a kitchen that did not need washing, because there was nothing else on this earth for her to do. At 12:25 the phone buzzed. She turned it over. It was 1 line. Delta, 2211. She read it 4 times. Then she opened the airline site and put the number in, and it was a flight from Southwest Florida International to Boston Logan, departing that afternoon at 3:50. At 4:05, Teddy Falco called her. She was standing on the sidewalk on Pleasant Street with a bag of groceries in one hand, and she stopped in the middle of the block to answer it, and she stayed stopped. He didn't say hello. "Are you sitting down?" he said. "What is it?" "I'm standing in his room," Teddy said. "I'm standing in it right now." She could hear the flatness of the sound around his voice, the way a voice sounds in a room with nothing left in it. "There's no bed," he said. "They took the frame apart and carried it down the back stairs this morning. The pole's gone. The chair's gone. The camera's gone off the wall, and there's 2 holes in the plaster where it was, and the curtains are open, and there's nothing in here. Nothing at all." Nora didn't say anything. "The van came at 7 o'clock this morning," he said. "Connecticut plates. They were gone by 5:30. She heard him breathe out. "It wasn't supposed to be till Saturday," he said. "The hearing's Saturday." They moved him 3 days early. The bag of groceries was still in her hand. There were people walking around her on both sides, on the sidewalk on Pleasant Street in Fall River at 4:05 in the afternoon. And a bus went by, and somewhere down the block a car alarm was going, and Nora Alves stood in the middle of all of it and could not move at all. "He's gone." Rosalind Marchetti was 66 years old, and she came into the lobby of a hotel on Thames Street in Newport at 9 in the morning with one bag and a leather folder under her arm, and Nora, who had been sitting in that lobby since 7 because she couldn't stand her own apartment any longer, knew her before she'd crossed half the floor. She didn't embrace her. She didn't cry. She put out her hand and shook Nora's once, firmly, and sat down across from her and said, "Tell me all of it, from the first day. And don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. It took an hour and 10 minutes. Rosalind didn't interrupt. When Nora came to the part about the camera and the 11 seconds of the razor, the older woman's jaw moved slightly, and that was all. At the end, she said, "Where's the notebook?" Nora put it on the table between them. "And the video." Nora put the card down beside it. Rosalind looked at both of those things for a long moment, without touching them. Then she opened the leather folder and took out a single document with a blue backer on it, and set it down next to them. "Do you know what this is?" "No, ma'am." "It's a durable power of attorney for health care," Rosalind said. "Executed in this state 9 years ago. He was 28. He'd just taken over from his father, and his lawyer told him to get his affairs in order, and he did it in an afternoon. The way you do a thing at that age when you don't believe any of it will ever apply to you." She turned it around so Nora could read the second page. "It names me. It has never been revoked." Nora looked at the signature. "But he stopped speaking to you." "He did, 2 years after he signed that." Rosalind's voice didn't change at all. "And in 7 years he never picked up a telephone, and he never sent a Christmas card, and he never once, in all that time, went and had this torn up, which he could have done in 5 minutes with any lawyer in Rhode Island." She put the document back in the folder. "My daughter has spent 11 months building a guardianship petition," she said. "She has spent a great deal of money on it, and the whole of it rests on there being nobody with prior legal authority to make medical decisions for him. She's about to find out there is. What happened after that happened over the next 4 days, and Nora saw almost none of it. It happened in a lawyer's office on Bellevue Avenue and then in a probate registry, and Rosalind's attorney filed on the Thursday, and the hearing that Vittoria had spent 11 months waiting for was continued before it began. But the thing that broke it wasn't the power of attorney. The thing that broke it was the chart. Rosalind's attorney subpoenaed the complete original medical record from the hospital in Providence, where Dante had been taken on the night of the accident, and from the neurology service that had reviewed him at 4 weeks, and from the physician of record who had signed every page since. It arrived on Wednesday afternoon, 400 and some pages of it, and Rosalind called Nora at 6 and asked her to come to the hotel and put a copy of 2 of those pages in front of her on the table. "Read the diagnosis," she said. Nora read it. She read it again. "Persistent vegetative state," she said. "That's what it says." "Now find the other thing," Rosalind said. Nora went through both pages line by line. The admission summary, the neurology consult, the 60-day review, the 11 monthly attestations after it, all of them signed in the same hand. "It isn't here," she said. "It isn't anywhere in it," Rosalind said. 400 pages. 11 months. Not one physician in this state has ever written the words brain death about my son. Because not one of them could have. Because it isn't what he has, and it isn't what he ever had. And any doctor who put it on paper would have been signing a death certificate for a man with a pulse. She folded her hands on the table. "He said it out loud," Rosalind said. "He said it in a hallway in that house. Once. To my daughter, and to whoever else was standing there. And nobody in 11 months asked him to write it down. And so it became true. They put it to Warren Hale on the Friday morning, in the conference room of an office on Bellevue Avenue, with Rosalind at one end of the table, and her attorney beside her, and a copy of the record in front of him, and the notebook, and a laptop with 41 seconds on it. He read the 2 pages the attorney marked for him. He watched the video twice. He was asked whether he had ever documented brain death in the chart of his patient. He didn't answer. He was asked whether he had informed the family that his patient met the clinical criteria for brain death. He didn't answer that either. He was asked what clinical basis he'd had for a continuous sedative order in a patient he had described as unresponsive. And he sat there with his hands flat on the table, an unhurried man of 56, who had been the physician to one family for 20 years, and looked at the surface of the table, and said nothing at all, for a very long time. He never denied one word of it. He simply stopped speaking. By Friday afternoon, the court had ordered an independent neurological evaluation of Dante Marchetti by a physician with no prior relationship to the family, to be conducted within 72 hours, at the facility outside Hartford where he now lay. They did it on the Monday morning at 10 o'clock, in a room on the 2nd floor of a long-term care facility, 20 minutes outside Hartford, and there were 9 people in it. The neurologist the court had appointed, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a resident with a clipboard, the facility's own physician, Rosalind Marchetti and her attorney, Vittoria Marchetti and hers, Nora, standing against the back wall because she had no standing in that room at all, and had been permitted in only as a witness of fact, and one more woman, near the door, in a plain gray jacket, who had come in with the court's people and had not been introduced and had not sat down. The sedative had been discontinued 48 hours earlier by order. He was on his back with the head of the bed raised, his eyes open, and Nora looked at him from 20 feet away and saw that they had not shaved him in 4 days. The neurologist began at 4 minutes past 10. She sat where he could see her, and she started with her own name and worked through the standard sequence. And Nora had read the protocol on a library computer 3 months earlier and knew every step of it before it came. Look at me. Look at the window. Follow my finger. Squeeze my hand. Squeeze it again. Blink twice. Move your thumb. Open your mouth. She did each one 3 times, with a pause between. The resident wrote. Nothing happened. She went to visual pursuit and held a small mirror to his right and moved it slowly across his field, and there was nothing. And she did it on the left, and there was nothing. She went to noxious stimulus, pressure at the nail bed, and got a flexion in the right arm, and the resident wrote that down, and everybody in that room who understood what it meant knew that it meant nothing at all, because a spinal cord does that on its own. At 7 minutes, she went back to command following and started over from the top. Look at me. Squeeze my hand. Blink once for yes. The clock on the wall behind the bed had a second hand, and Nora watched it go around and around. 8 minutes. 9. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the resident's pen. Across the room, on the other side of the bed, Vittoria Marchetti had her hands folded at her waist and was standing very straight, and at some point in the 10th minute, Nora looked over and saw that she was smiling. Not broadly, just the corners of it, held. The neurologist sat back at 11 minutes and took the glasses down out of her hair and said, "All right." She looked at the resident. "Let's document." "Doctor," Nora said. Every head in the room turned. She had not spoken since she'd walked in. "May I try one thing?" "This isn't your evaluation," Vittoria's attorney said. "May I try one thing?" Nora said again, to the neurologist. And the neurologist looked at her for about 3 seconds and said, "Come here." Nora crossed the room. She didn't touch him. She stood at the side of the bed and bent down close to his left ear, and she put her hand flat on the rail, and she sang. It came out very quietly, 4 or 5 notes of it, the old thing out of a village in the Azores that her mother had sung to her before she had any language to hold it in, and she got to the end of the second line and started it again from the beginning, the way her mother had always done, and there was not one other sound in that room. Then she straightened up and said, "Mr. Marchetti, blink once for yes." He blinked once. Somebody behind her exhaled. The neurologist was already leaning forward. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, "blink once if you can hear me." He blinked once. Blink twice if you are in Rhode Island. 2 blinks. Blink once if you are in a hospital. 1 blink. And that was that. It took the neurologist 4 more minutes to confirm it in 3 modalities, and she did it in a voice that had gone completely flat, the way a person's voice goes when they are being extremely careful. And then she asked the resident for a letterboard. There was one in the facility's own supply cupboard down the hall. It took 2 minutes to fetch. The room had not moved. Rosalind Marchetti had both hands over her mouth. Vittoria was standing exactly where she had been standing, and she was not smiling anymore. The neurologist held up the board and said, "Mr. Marchetti, I'm going to read the rows. Blink when I reach yours." And she started, and Nora, standing 3 feet back with her arms wrapped around herself, understood what was about to happen and thought, "He'll give them her name. He'll spell his sister." 3rd row, 1 blink, KLM, 1 blink, M. The neurologist wrote it on the pad the resident was holding. 1st row, A, 1 blink, A. 4th row, T, then T again. 2nd row, nothing at first, then 1 blink at the very end of it. It took 11 minutes altogether. M, A, T, T, E, O. Nobody in that room said anything. Rosalind lowered her hands and stared at the letters on the pad, and her face had gone completely white. And then the woman in the gray jacket, who had stood by the door for 1 hour and 11 minutes without saying a word or writing anything down, walked forward to the foot of the bed and opened a leather case and held it up. And there was a badge in it and a photograph. "Paula Whitlock," she said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Providence office." Nobody leaves this room. What Paula Whitlock told them in that room, and told them again in a federal office in Providence over the following 2 days, was that Matteo Barone had been a cooperating witness for the Bureau for a little over 3 years. He'd come in on his own. He'd worn a wire into rooms in Providence and Fall River and Fairhaven, and he'd handed the government, the docs and the contracts, and the men who signed them, piece by piece, for 36 months, and it had been the largest thing that office had ever run in this state. And in the fall of the previous year, Dante Marchetti had found out. The Bureau knew he'd found out, because Matteo had told them, and the Bureau had made a plan to bring their witness in and shut it down, and the date they'd chosen was a Thursday. The accident was on the Tuesday night. They had never been able to prove the last part of it, which was why the plain sedan had sat at the bend in the road outside a house on Bellevue Avenue for 11 months, waiting for a man in an upstairs room to wake up and say a name. He said it on a Monday morning in Connecticut, and it was the only thing he'd been able to say in 11 months, and it was enough. The other thing came out 4 days later, and it came out of Vittoria's own attorney. She had known, not on the night, and not from anyone in that house. She had learned it 8 days after the accident, from a man on the waterfront who'd told her what Matteo Barone had canceled, and when he'd canceled it, and she had gone home, and she had sat with it, and she had told nobody, not the police, not her mother, not the physician who came every Thursday. She had let a room go quiet on the second floor, and she had gone to a lawyer's office and started a guardianship petition instead. Rosalind flew back to Newport and asked to see her daughter, and they met in the library of the house where both of them had grown up, and Nora heard about it afterward only because Sylvia Kane had been standing in the hall. Vittoria said she hadn't touched him. She said it more than once. She said she hadn't laid a hand on her brother and that nothing in that house had been her doing, and her mother let her finish. Then Rosalind said, "I'm not asking what you did. I'm asking what you didn't do." Vittoria didn't have an answer for that. She never has. They arrested Matteo Barone 12 days later in a corridor on the ground floor of the federal building in Providence, where he'd come in to meet his handler. He put his hands out before anyone asked him to. He looked at Paula Whitlock and said, "Is he awake?" She said he was. He nodded once and said, "Good." And then he didn't say anything else at all. And they walked him down the corridor and through the door at the end of it. And that was the last time anybody in this story saw him. Dante Marchetti spent 7 months in rehabilitation in Providence. It was not a miracle, and nobody in that building ever pretended it was. His speech came back the way a road comes back after a washout, in pieces, out of order. With gaps in it he had to walk around. And it has never come back the whole way, and it isn't going to. His left hand is weak, and closes slowly, and will not hold a cup. He walks with a cane, and he'll use it for the rest of his life. And on bad days he doesn't walk at all. In the 4th month, when he could get about a dozen words out in a row, he asked Nora to come to the unit, and he had a folder ready, and he pushed it across the table with his good hand and told her what was in it. And it was a number with a great many zeros after it. She pushed it back. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he asked her the other thing, slowly, 1 word at a time, whether she would stay. And Nora Alves said, "I never went anywhere." He sold the docs. He sold the contracts and the freight and the leases and everything under them. And what couldn't be sold was closed, and the men who'd signed for him found other work or didn't. Then he took the house on Bellevue Avenue, the whole of it, and turned it into a residential center for people with severe brain injury, and he named it Inez House. And he wrote one rule into the staff handbook on the first page above everything else, which is that every person who works in that building speaks out loud to every resident in their care, every day, by name. The Board of Nursing in Massachusetts reinstated Nora's license in the spring, with the original matter vacated and the record expunged. She runs the place. Sylvia Kane manages the household staff. Teddy Falco drives the van. Vittoria Marchetti was indicted in Newport County on charges relating to falsified medical documentation and fraud upon the probate court, and the case is still moving through the system, and her mother goes to every hearing and sits in the back and does not speak to her afterward. Inez Alves moved into the 2nd floor of Inez House 13 months after it opened, into a room at the north end with the light in it all morning, and on a Tuesday in the fall, 19 months after a woman in an apron first pulled back a curtain in that room, Dante Marchetti stood at a sink with a straight razor with a bone handle and shaved himself for the first time since the Coast Road, slowly, badly, with his good hand, and cut himself twice. Then he came out into the hallway, where Nora was standing at the desk with a chart in her hands, and he walked the 22 steps to her with the cane, and it took him a while, and she waited, and he said, without stopping and without stumbling once, Good morning, Miss Alves. It's Tuesday. It's raining out. There's a lesson in this that costs nothing to learn and changes everything about how we treat one another. A person's worth was never in whether they can answer us. Dignity doesn't switch off because a body stops cooperating, and the people we walk past as if they aren't there are still there, listening, in more rooms than we would ever guess. The ones who do this work, the aides, the nurses, the daughters and sons at bedsides, are the most invisible people in our world, and they are paid the least for the labor that asks the most heart. And in the end, power is measured by how many people fear you, but a life is measured by how many stay when you have nothing left to give. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like and a share so more people can find these stories each day. We would love to know how this one landed with you and whether it touched something in your own life. So please tell us in the comments, honestly and from the heart, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we wish you good health, quiet days, and peace in your home. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.